The New York Rangers become the first team to secure a spot in the conference finals. We've got that plus the other three series still ongoing and our women's hockey spotlight all coming up on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to the Friday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. I'm Gil Martin. It's great to welcome my Friday co-host, Rachel Donner. And Rachel, we already know one of the teams that is going to be in the Final Four.
It is the New York Rangers after a remarkable comeback victory last night. And it was definitely the Chris Kreider show, we should say.
Definitely the Chris Kreider show coming up big, the natural hat trick, and got to be a crushing loss for the Carolina Hurricanes. Some questionable, I would say some soft goals let in over the course of that comeback. And to blow that lead at home when you're that close to forcing a Game 7 after being down 3-0, that is a tough way to be eliminated from the Stanley Cup playoffs.
Yeah, I just think that they got too conservative as the game went on, and that just opened the door for the Rangers to be able to get there. And I do think that goaltending has been this little like worrisome, almost like a mosquito bothering them every year. And they've had some really good goaltenders that just haven't been able to get it done in the playoffs beyond, a certain point. And there's a lot of questions on this Carolina team, but I don't want to take away from the New York Rangers and what they were able to do here, because I really think, there was a lot of people after the Hurricanes won 2 games in that series that were like, oh no, are the Rangers imploding? Are they not for real? And no, they are. It's fine. They're fine.
And look, when you get up 3-0 in a series, you only need one more out of 4. There's just no margin for error for the team that's behind. And the Rangers, I think, handled it well. They did not give in to sort of the pressure of, oh no, here come the Hurricanes. They've won 2. They're at home. They're this close to forcing a Game 7. I think the Rangers emotionally handled things well. But boy, oh boy, a question about the goaltending. You mentioned it for Carolina. Is it problematic in your mind that they don't seem to have an established number one guy who is the clear-cut guy they're relying on in the playoffs?
I mean, I think so to some degree. I think that usually teams go with the hot hand in these cases, and there really wasn't one 100% in this situation. So I think that is definitely a part of it. Now, also, I do think the defense kind of let goaltending down a little bit, especially late in this Game 6 that we just saw. You saw, especially in that go-ahead goal at the very end of the game, there were 2 Carolina defensemen out front that did not clear Kreider away after he had just scored 2 goals. Yeah. And I think that is a huge, huge part of what happens there.
I agree. And when you add to the fact that that's where Chris Kreider scores most of his goals, I mean, that's his MO. Get in front of the net, get those, if you added up the distance of all the goals he scores, it's not that much further than the number of goals that he scores. And that's not to take anything away from Chris Kreider. That's a skill in and of itself. It's a very important skill, and it becomes even more important in the playoffs, as we saw last night. But if you're Carolina, you've got to be trying to take that when he's on the ice. That's the first thing you've got to be aware of, is to take away that net front presence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was a big part of the failure there. I just don't understand how that comes to pass. Like it just especially like I said for that go ahead goal.
Yeah, no question about it. And now, questions in Carolina. Rod Brindamore, is he going to be back? I know that a lot of people are not worried, but until the ink is signed on the new contract, that's a big thing to leave hanging, especially since I think Rod Brindamore is such an established coach.
Yeah, I think it is interesting because it'll depend it to some degree if he wants to keep his entire coaching staff together in order to resign. If he's loyal to them and management above him wants to make some changes because something has to change to break through to get them further in the playoffs. I think that could be a sticking point, but if he's willing to make some changes there, I think it's a no-brainer to bring him back.
I think so too. I'm very respectful of Rod Brindamore, the way he coaches, what he's accomplished in Carolina. If I'm the GM, I'm bringing him back. That's bottom line in my mind. As for the New York Rangers, though, uh, I give them credit because they went through the first 7 games of the playoffs. It almost looked too easy. And then they got the challenge from Carolina, and they really did answer back last night.
They did, and I think that, they deserve this, victory. They deserve being in the championship for the conference, and, we'll see what happens there. I do wanna touch more on the offseason for Carolina, though, because they have a mountain of free agents coming up.
Yeah.
And they're not gonna be able to re-sign all of them, and obviously, there was, like, the guys they picked up at trade deadline, like Jake Gensel, was he a rental? We'll see, but, you know, you look at their roster and half of their forwards are free agents, half of their defensemen are free agents. I mean, that is a lot of contracts and decisions to make, and, I think it's gonna be a little tougher on the defensive side of things for them, because I think, you wanna keep Brady Shea, you wanna keep Brett Pesce, I think, um, at least, and I just think that this is going to be just a holistic change to this team based on what the assignment is.
Yeah, no question that the team is going to have to look very different next year. But, you talked about change being needed to get them over that next hump, so to speak. It may not just be on the coaching staff. You're going to see some roster changes, and managing that is going to be the key to continued success in Raleigh.
Yeah, absolutely. And who they decide to keep and if they're going to change their system a little bit will affect who they decide to keep and, who they're going to go after, if anybody in free agency, or they're going to try and build from within and have some prospects move up the chain. I can't even imagine there being more than 65% of this roster being the same next year.
No, and a trade may be interesting to trade someone's rights if they're a restricted free agent to try
Yep.
to shake up the roster a little bit. It will be interesting to see how that happens. We have got a lot more to get to on today's show. There are 3 other series to discuss. Plus, Erica Ayala will join us next for our bi-weekly women's hockey spotlight. All that and more coming up on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
Buying tickets to your favorite events like the NHL and NBA playoffs shouldn't be stressful. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. Game Time is an authorized marketplace of the NBA, which makes getting playoff tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to tip off with killer last minute deals, all in pricing, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying those coveted NBA playoff seats. My favorite part of the Game Time app is that it's great for getting notified about those last minute flash deals, and you can save even more with zone deals where you pick a section and let Game Time choose your seat. And with that all in pricing, there's no surprise fees at checkout. Your tickets are sent directly to your phone, so you never have to dig through email. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem with the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today at last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
It's time now for our bi-weekly women's hockey spotlight. So we welcome in Erica L. Ayala. And Erica, lots going on right now, including the PWHL final now in our sights.
That's right. We have one team that has already punched their ticket. That is PWHL Boston. And we talked about Toronto being that they had the top seed. They were able to pick their opponent, but their opponent has taken them to game 5. So we'll get into that. But Rachel, I figure we'll get the Boston advancing out of the way since it seems to be a sore spot for you.
Listen. All 3 games go to overtime, the middle of which goes to a triple overtime. Like, heart is breaking for Montreal at the moment. They just could not get it done.
Yeah, it was, tough to see Montreal. They started, changing up their lines, which was also interesting to see that we saw Michaela Grant-Mentis at one point on that top line with Marie-Philippe Poulin. And that alone is kind of a story for Montreal because, Ottawa let go of Bucky, as she's known, Michaela Grant-Mentis. And then you find her on the top line with arguably for some and for some not arguably at all the best women's hockey player, certainly for right now, but to your point, Montreal they couldn't get past Boston. I think it turned out that Boston really was able to turn things up in the postseason, and that's what happens when you just get to the postseason. You have players like Amanda Pelkey. She's one of, I guess, 5 players with 3 points in the playoffs. Her breakdown is 2 goals and an assist. Tapani, who came over actually from Minnesota, also making an impact. And so, good on Boston. We have been critical of some of their stars, including, of course, Hillary Knight getting started a little bit slow, but Boston now in a position where they have a chance to compete for the first ever PWHL championship.
And I think it's good for women's hockey to have 3 overtime playoff games, including multiple overtimes in one of them. I think it's just a great showcase for the sport and for the league.
Well, I mean, again, we knew that this was going to be a pretty heavy competition. And I think what you're seeing now is perhaps, if there was any breaking in that was happening for some of these elite level international players, once you get to there's a trophy on the line, we're seeing that things are really ramping up. To your point, there's been multiple overtimes. There's really been no blowouts, with exception perhaps of that game against Minnesota and Toronto, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but not surprised to see what we're seeing at all, because this is what the PWHL said they wanted, right? The best competing against each other in one central league. And so, yeah, fireworks. I also thought it was interesting. I was having a conversation with someone from the PWHL, actually, and they were traveling back to the East Coast from Minnesota after the last game. And I did not realize that, at least in Montreal, when you go into overtime, they can still serve alcohol during overtime. And so that's very different than anything I've ever experienced in the States, where you go to a concert and a performer is late, or, a game goes into OT and you're wanting a little more, beer or whatever. They can't get it. Hopefully you planned ahead.
Yeah.
Oh man, I just thought that was funny. But let's go to the other series, because again, Toronto coming in as the top seed. They did get that early win against Minnesota. One of 4, I believe, shutouts in the playoffs, and it was a 4-1 rout by the I almost said the Toronto Six. Wow, PWHL Toronto. And other than that, it's been back and forth. They also shut out Minnesota in game 2. But then Minnesota has been able to really come roaring back here. They get a shutout 2-0 over Toronto in game 3 on May 13th, and then get a very tightly contested double overtime win against Toronto in game 4 in Minnesota to force game 5, which will be later on today. I mean, again, you pick your opponent, and I'm thinking maybe after dropping those 2 games, after knowing they got pulled out of the or handpicked by Toronto, PWHL Minnesota, Gil was ready to play.
No doubt about it. Now, question, do you think Boston has a preference as to who they face in the final?
Yeah, that's an interesting question indeed. I think Minnesota's a scrappy team. I wouldn't want to necessarily underestimate them. I think also you have to take into consideration that unfortunately for Toronto, they lost their top scorer in Natalie Spooner, who we've talked a lot about in the women's hockey spotlight in the last handful of episodes. So I mean, maybe if you want to take your chances, you go and see if Toronto can get through, just because, again, one of the top scorers in the league, and certainly their top scorer, is out. They listed her as long-term injury reserve. So that means it's unlikely that we'll see her for the remainder of the playoffs.
The PWHL awards, talk to me about that. Where are we at with that?
Yeah, so we already have the PWHL announcing a few of the finalists for their awards. We have the Rookie of the Year, Emma Malte, Alina Mueller, and Grace Zumwinkle. Now, of course, this is the inaugural season of the league, so true rookies are considered those who have, who are playing in their first professional league. And we also see that we have the Coach of the Year finalists in Corey Chevery, who just lost to head coach of PWHL Boston, Courtney Kessel, and Troy Ryan of PWHL Toronto. And also we have Forward of the Year, Alex Carpenter from PWHL New York, who we'll talk about in a little bit. Marie-Philippe Poulin just talked about, and of course, Natalie Spooner, who we also talked about. I would be surprised personally if it's not Spooner that wins that. Again, we just talked about what Spooner has meant. I do think, though, that Marie-Philippe Poulin is likely to pull a decent amount of votes and maybe even get it, but I would give it to Spooner if I was voting. But that kind of takes me to a conversation that, as a member and the chair of the women's hockey chapter of the Professional Hockey Writers Association, that we wanted to have, because we saw that some of the voters for this award did not include outlets like the Ice Garden, outlets like the Victory Press, or even the Hockey News and their women's hockey vertical. And that to me was extremely surprising. We know that these outlets have been covering women's hockey since there was the original NWHL. Some of them have gone through the ups and downs of what we've seen in women's professional hockey. And I can report that, as part of the Professional Hockey Writers Association, we have had meetings with the league where we expressed that, where we said that, this is a little bit it's a little bit disheartening to see that more, what I would say, independent, and that meaning non-mainstream media, outlets that are running independently of any major funding source, that they were not involved. And, that being said, I thought it was also interesting that and not that we don't see this, but usually in other leagues that I cover, when they have awards, or specifically classifications like, the top 5 players in the league, your first team kind of awards. Sometimes we do see head coaches and or GMs vote for those awards. But traditionally in sports, what we see, Rachel and Gil, is that for individual awards, a lot of times those awards are voted by media members. And if there's multiple voting, even fan voting at sometimes, those are separated. But we see that, all of the coaches and general managers also included on this list. They also have some retired players like Megan Duggan, which, great to get them involved, but not something that we generally see. So I think a lot of people were just a little bit curious as to how the awards were kind of divvied out and why some, again, smaller, what I would call independent outlets were not included. But anyway, one team that will certainly not be competing for the championship this year is PWHL New York. But by way of, and we talked about this on the last segment, by way of being able to win the most games since their elimination, although they were really the only team that was in contention this year anyway, they do get the number 1 overall pick. But they will have that pick under a new head coach. As head coach, Howie Draper had mutually agreed to part ways and vacate that position. He will remain, though, Rachel, with PWHL New York in kind of a senior advisory role in, of all things, scouting. So,
Right.
On the one hand, I don't know that if someone was unsuccessful in kind of putting a team together, that they are maybe the best gauge of talent. And I've talked about, honestly, it was a little surprising for Howie and Pascal Daou, who is their general manager, to multiple times say that they didn't see any film on the players that were actively on their roster. So that's a little concerning. But I think also some people are seeing this as maybe it's like one of those like emeritus roles where it's a title, but maybe it doesn't really have any teeth.
Or maybe he's under contract, so we might as well keep him in the organization and get something out of the contract.
Yeah, I mean, all of the above are possible. But we did get to hear from Pascal Daou. I have been very vocal that there is a great head coach on the PWHL coaching staff who has familiarity with women's hockey, who has familiarity with a very short women's hockey season and has yielded results almost immediately. And that, of course, is Colton Orr, who also coached in the catchment area of PWHL New York, which of course includes New Jersey, Long Island, and Connecticut. And so I would love to see Colton Orr really get a shot. Pascal Daou said that they will consider everyone. They're going to cast a wide net. He also did say, though, that the head coach, he's expecting that she or he will be able to have an input on their coaching staff. So not only are we going to get a new head coach, Rachel, but it's possible that we could also see some assistants relocate or change roles. What are your thoughts on what PWHL New York needs as far as a head coach?
I think they need a coach who understands their players and how to use them properly. I think that's the biggest issue with this team, and how to put a lineup together that can work together well. And I think needs to be more involved in creating the roster for this team the next year, and really just having it be a team effort with the GM and working together to figure out the right strategy and figuring out that system that'll work with the players they have.
Yeah, indeed. And we also heard from Pascal that they are expecting to have that coach and hoping to have the coach sit at the draft table, as he said, when the draft is in Minnesota. That being said, they don't want to rush the process. I also asked Pascal if player feedback and input regarding the coach had any indication and bearing on the decision to mutually part ways with Howie, to which he said, of course, they hold exit interviews, but it wasn't necessarily something specific coming from the players. I was dealing with that this offseason with the Seattle Kraken, and reports from national writers that was perhaps the case, while Seattle Kraken players were saying that wasn't. I'm curious to see. I don't know if we'll ever know for sure, but again, there had been reports in PWHL New York that PWHL New York players were a little bit more active in kind of aligning their their different line mates and things of that nature, which could indicate that Howie Draper really didn't have or didn't take ownership of the lineup. Well, I suppose we will see how it all shakes out. But again, we have game 5 against Toronto and Minnesota tonight. We will see who gets to advance and take on PWHL Boston for the inaugural PWHL championship. Of course, once we have a winner, we will come back here on the Women's Hockey Spotlight to talk about that. But always a pleasure, Rachel and Gil, to join you. And I will leave you to talk about the rest of your lineup in men's hockey.
All right, Erica, thanks so much, and looking forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. So we have 3 series remaining. Lots of exciting hockey to go in round 2. And it all gets started tonight.
For me, this second round has been more exciting than the first round.
Yeah.
For sure. All of the series going to 6 games minimum. So I think that's been a lot of fun overall. And, last night we saw Vancouver win, taking the lead in that series against Edmonton with the late goal from JT Miller to prevent overtime, which I think was a good thing, honestly, in this situation, just because it was the late game for us East Coasters. But
yes,
that being said, the other 2 series that face off tonight, I honestly could not predict them. I think that's what's been so fun about both of these series, with Florida leading 3-2. They have a chance to clinch, but it's on the road in Boston. And I think the most mysterious series of the playoffs thus far is the Dallas-Colorado series. But what do you think?
No, that Dallas-Colorado series has been so entertaining and difficult to predict.
No clue.
And if you think you do, you're fooling yourself, right? I mean,
Yes.
The amazing thing to me, if I take a step back and look at all the playoff series in round 2, and you mentioned round 2, I think it is much more exciting than what round 1 was. But there were no major upsets in round 1. There were no wild card teams that advanced. Therefore, in round 2, you've got a lot of really great matchups with, the best teams in each division kind of facing off against each other.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that, you're just getting the best of the best here, and it's just who can prevail. Definitely some battles of attrition, definitely some, goaltending coming through, I think, big time. I would say, especially in the Florida Boston series, with the losing team only scoring 1 or 2 goals in every single one of these games. So I do think that that's a big factor. And I think that, it is weird, but Boston feels like an underdog team here, even though they aren't in all practical senses of the word.
Well, the teams are different in the way they're built. I think Boston is more top heavy as far as their forward talent is concerned, where Florida, I think, has a little more depth. The goaltending on both teams is excellent. And then, home ice advantage, how big is that going to be tonight when Boston is trying to hang on and force a game 7.
Yeah, I don't know. Florida's really good on the road. That's the thing,
They
is
are.
that I just don't think that that is going to be the factor here in that game 6 tonight. I really think it's just going to be who makes the fewer mistakes.
And a lot of the series has been that way. And, again, I think when you're talking about top level teams like this that are so evenly matched, that's what's going to be the deciding factor more often than not.
Yeah, I absolutely think so. And I do think that, the Bruins missing Brad Marchand is a factor, but I don't think it's a big enough factor that it's going to necessarily affect the outcome of the game, because I think there's a certain mentality of like, do it for Brad Marchand that's on the Boston side. And then, of course, Florida doesn't have to face him. So I feel like it sort of evens out. And we saw that to some degree in game 5, of course. So I do think that continues into game 6, especially with it being in Boston. I think that's where the Marchand of it all comes into play. By the way, I'm glad to see he's admitting what exactly goes on in the NHL. That he would know it's a sucker punch because he has been on the other side of things.
Yeah.
But,
Give him credit for the candidness that he
yeah,
displayed for
yeah.
sure. And then, Saturday, only one game now with the Rangers Carolina series being over, and that's Vancouver and Edmonton. And this has been a battle throughout as well.
Yeah, I think that this is another series where you look at, the offensive firepower on Edmonton, and you think that Vancouver's season overall was a little bit more uneven, I would say, versus Edmonton. I know, like Edmonton was more of a, oh no, oh no, oh wait, they're going to get it together, and then they peaked at the right time, right? If you
Yeah.
just kind of look at their trajectories, you would think that the Oilers would have a better chance here to just dominate and take advantage of any little, mistake or any little lull in intensity by Vancouver. But Vancouver's been able to hold them off. And I think, you know, there's a reason why Vancouver did so well this season. And I think coaching has a lot to do with it.
I think so too, and they've been able to do this without their starting goaltender for part of the series. The amazing thing about this series, 5 games, all decided by 1 goal.
Yeah, and I think that's the difference, right? Where Vancouver just doesn't let up. They don't. They play the full 60, and I think that Edmonton to some degree doesn't. And I think that has been the difference in this series so far. And Edmonton was able to take advantage in game 2 to some degree, but even in that game 4, I think it was a lot closer than that, even that 1 goal. I just feel like Vancouver could have won that game.
No doubt about that. Well, it's going to be a very interesting weekend of hockey ahead, and we will know by the time we do next week's show who the other 3 teams joining the New York Rangers are going to be. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV in the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. Everybody have a great weekend. I will be back Monday interviewing 3 of our local hosts about some of the biggest stories happening in the NHL. Obviously, a lot of playoff talk to be had. Have a great weekend. Stay safe. And thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.